I am the co-president of SciPolPack. That's Science Policy Pack at NC State. We are a club of graduate students who are interested in gaining education and professional development in science policy, as well as practicing science policy. So welcome to our, I think it's second or third virtual science policy seminar. We are just so lucky today to have Steph Guerra, so I will let Ryan go ahead and introduce her.
Thanks, Anna. I'm Ryan Tam, and I'm the social media chair for Science Policy Pack. To just give a quick introduction about Dr. Steph Guerra. She's currently working as a biomedical research scientist at the Office of Research and Development at the Department of Veteran Affairs as a AAAS Science and Technology Policy Fellow. Her work focuses on building infrastructure to drive research impacts. Steph has also served as a Mirzian Science Policy Fellow at the National Academies of Science, focused on expanding the diversity, equity, and inclusion of the scientific community. She received her PhD from Harvard in biological and biomedical sciences, while engaging in policy in many other ways, too various to list here. So let's welcome Dr. Steph Guerra.
Oh, well, thank you. Can everybody hear me? Okay, great. I'm going to share my presentation. Thanks, everybody, for sharing your evening with me. I'm really excited to chat with you. This is one of my favorite topics, which is finding your way in a science policy career. So before I get started, I just wanted to kind of talk a little bit about what the format is going to be for this session. We wanted to make it as interactive as possible. And so that means is hopefully I won't be talking the whole time. I'm going to give about half of my presentation, and then we're going to do some brief breakout room just for 10 minutes. There'll be probably about 5 or 6 people in each breakout room to sort of discuss the concept which we're working on today, which is finding your why you want to be doing a science policy fellowship, and also like why a particular science policy fellowship. And so you'll have an opportunity to speak among your group about defining your own why. That's going to be about halfway through. And then we have the next half of the presentation. And I say that because the last half has some really great stuff too. So don't just run away because you don't want to talk to people. It's only 10 minutes. You don't have to turn your screen on. It's totally fine. But I hope you'll be able to stay throughout the presentation, and then we'll do some time for question and answer. I think we should be able to finish up the bulk of everything by 7, but I'm also happy to stay till 7:30 if there are questions that you want answered. And so yes, I'm happy to be here. Thanks again for the invitation, and we'll get started. I think the first thing I just wanted to kind of briefly go through, thanks to Ryan for that introduction, but give a little bit more context to my own science policy journey. When I'm giving advice to people, I often want to hear about their journeys, because I think understanding where you come from really helps to contextualize the advice that you're going to be receiving and the advice you might be giving. So I got my PhD at Harvard Medical School. And while I was there, the thing I realized about my work was that I most often liked talking to non-scientists about my work than scientists. So I did this in a lot of different ways, most often through science outreach and communication groups. As you can see here, this is a picture of me that is basically me giving a thesis talk, but at a level that anyone could understand. And then I kind of went through my PhD, suffered through it, got through it. The other side's the best. Keep going, everybody. And finally graduated. And then I actually made the move to DC specifically for the Mirzian Science Policy Fellowship at the National Academies of Science. And so this picture here down in the bottom right is me and 2 of my co-fellows were on the speaker's balcony. This was just a field trip that we had taken to go speak with people on the Hill about sort of diversity and inclusion issues. And it was a really wonderful fellowship, and I'm happy to answer more specific questions about that later as well. After that fellowship, which ends in April, so that was April of 2019, I at that point realized or found out that I got the AAAS Science Policy Fellowship, which doesn't start till September. So I actually spent the summer doing a bunch of freelance projects. And it was like one of the best summers of my life because I just sort of worked from home. It's kind of similar to like the situation here where I was just working from home, except I could go outside. So that was like the really, really great summer. And so that's sort of what brought me here. During graduate school, I really made it a point to seek out opportunities outside of the lab. And those are the opportunities that got me to getting to science policy fellowships. I always tell people that, you know, that's what really makes you stand out. And if I hadn't done the extracurriculars that I was involved in, I definitely would not be where I was today. So hopefully you also have a mentor that's either supportive of outside work or indifferent to outside work, because either one really works. And before I continue, I just want to put out this slide here, which all AAAS fellows have to put out too, is that this presentation doesn't represent anyone's views but my own. So just know that going forward. Okay, so the reason why I wanted to give this talk in particular, and I focused it on finding your why, is because there's so many different science policy career paths. So I think a lot of people hear science policy and they don't really understand what science policy means. And it's understandable because there's so many things it can mean. So I, last summer, actually put together a career map, which this is the link here. I'm gonna share my slides later. And so hopefully that you can get them from the Science Policy Pack group. And so the link is here. But basically, this web showcases all the different sort of types of science policy jobs you can have. Each of the green nodes represents a general category of science policy career path. And then branching off of that are the different places you can do those types of things. So some policy careers are focused more on data gathering or convening of experts to come up with lists of recommendations. That's sort of what the National Academies does. They bring together groups of experts. And then if you work at the National Academies, you're sort of facilitating conversations among those experts, building bridges between them, and helping them to come to a conclusion about a specific topic, whether that's how to increase the representation of women in science, or whether it's about how to prevent oil spills in the future. It really runs the gamut. And some of the other types of policy career paths are listed here. Things like advocacy, actually writing policy. So whether that's at the state or federal level. And when we say writing policy, we're also talking not just about big P policy, which is laws, but also little p policy, which means like organizational policy. So you can write things for, you know, an executive branch is responsible for implementing policy. So they essentially often have to come up with rules and things that other people follow based on a law that was written. So there's a lot of different ways in which policy is either written, enacted, implemented. If you're working in the executive branch, a lot of times what you're working on is actually policy implementation or managing programs that were based on a policy or a law that was written. So there's a lot more to kind of go into that. I think that could be an entire talk on in and of itself, but I just wanted to sort of spell that out to sort of contextualize this whole conversation, because part of sort of defining your why is figuring out the types of activities that you enjoy in addition to the topic areas that you're interested in. And so something I always get asked is how to prepare for a science policy career while you're in graduate school. And this is a infographic from a report that I wrote. Actually started writing it last summer, but it is recently finished with an organization up at Harvard called the Scientific Citizenship Initiative. And what we did was we talked to science policy professionals and sort of asked them how they made the transition to a science policy career. And then we sort of qualitatively compared those answers and determined how, you know, the similarities and differences among those answers. And so here's 12 of the ways to prepare for a science policy career. Many of these were mentioned by over and over again during our qualitative interviews. some of them are probably pretty obvious. Enroll in fellowships. That's what we're talking about today. But some of the other ones were things that I actually hadn't done intentionally during my time in graduate school. Finding a mentor outside of the lab, I think, is something that's extremely important and is often not done for a variety of reasons. But if you can find someone through an extracurricular organization or through a cross-registered course that can sort of help to guide you along your path in your policy interests or in advocacy interests, that's a really good resource to have, especially as you transition to this new career. Another is to not only participate in extracurricular activities, but lead and found new extracurricular activities. One of the biggest things that is important for science policy is engaging in science communication and outreach organizations. And I don't just say that because I'm biased, because that's what I did, but that was something that was mentioned by every single person that we interviewed. So if you're interested in learning more about this report, that is, I think it's online now. If not, it will be in a couple of days. So that is up there. And so now we're going to transition to talking about fellowships. So listed here are just a few of many of the fellowships that exist. Some of them you probably recognize, like the AAAS Fellowship or the Mir-Zion, but there's others out there that are affiliated specifically with professional societies that aren't, there's some professional societies that have fellowships with AAAS, but some have completely their own fellowships. So for example, the American Society for Human Genetics has its own rotational fellowship, as does the American Association for Cancer Research. And the reason why I know that is because I applied for both of them and was rejected from both of them. So the point of this slide is there's a lot of opportunities out there. And they all have their pros and cons, and you're going to get rejected from many of them. But eventually, if this is something you want to do, just keep at it, stay persistent. And, after all those rejections, I kind of realized that the fellowships that I got into were the ones that really were where I was supposed to be, honestly. Yeah, I guess I just say rejection a lot of times is an opportunity. And even though it feels really awful in the moment, that's a little woo-woo, but you'll end up where you should be. Okay, let's see. Oh, and the last thing I'll say about rejection as well is that I applied for the AACR fellowship and I hated the fact that I was rejected, but instead of being like all embarrassed by the fact that I didn't get it, because I was one of the final two and then I was not chosen. And so I think a couple years ago, I would have been so embarrassed and been like, oh my gosh, I can't believe I didn't get it. Instead, I engaged with the interviewers and sort of stayed in contact with them and stayed very friendly with them. And they ended up being one of my summer freelance jobs was through that organization. So I just say really leverage your connections, even those that come from failed opportunities. Okay. So the point of this whole talk is to think about why a fellowship is the right fit for you. And the reason I say that is I think a lot of people focus on why I'm the right fit for that fellowship. So when they're in their essay, they're trying to fit themselves into this mold that the fellowship will want them to be in. The problem with that is a few things. One, it's not authentic, and I think it's often I would just say the benefit of finding, or I'm all getting confused, but I think you understand. You need to find a fellowship that is the right fit for you, and the reason why you need to do that is because, first of all, if you find a fellowship that's the right fit for you, getting the fellowship is not the only thing. You have to actually take advantage of it and have a good time and find the right connections. And so you need to focus on finding the best fellowship for you so that you actually leverage the fellowship to help you pivot to your next career. Just getting a science policy fellowship is not enough. You have to really take advantage of it and thrive in it. And so do it with intentionality. And the second reason is if you focus on trying to find a fellowship that's the right fit for you, it really comes through in your essay. If you're focusing not only on your qualifications, but also why this fellowship is the absolute right, best reason for you to pivot your career. And I think it'll become a little bit more clear as I go forward. So in order to think about why a fellowship is the right fit for you, you have to understand who you are first and what you want and finding your why. So here are a lot of things I did over the course of the year 2018 to sort of self-reflect and think about what I wanted about what I wanted in order to pivot to the science policy career. So right, so let me look here. Great. So in order to sort of self-reflect, I think the biggest piece of advice I have, and this is something I recently learned as well, is to start a career journal in your current job. So in your research job, or if you're not in graduate school, have just a part of, a piece of paper or a journal or something where at the end of the day, and you don't have to do it every day, but you could do it at the end of every week or just whenever it speaks to you. Think about what makes your heart sing in your current job. So if you did something really great, if you got a great compliment because you wrote this report really well, if you led a meeting well, if you put on an event like this event and it went well, you can put that down and you can say, okay, I really enjoyed helping people. I really enjoyed how this made me feel. What makes you want to pull your hair out? So if you hate getting constant barrage of emails from your PI asking you to change a figure, you can put that down on your list, because there are going to be some science policy jobs that are actually kind of similar to that, where your job is to support the work of one person. Like if you're in a political job where you're working for a senator, a lot of times you might get requests that require immediate responses and you have to sort of put a fire out. And there's other policy jobs where it's a little slower pace and a little bit more independent. And so you kind of need to decide where you fit there. Also spelling out your successes, your failures, and how you've overcome a challenge. And if you do that over the course of a month or so, you can start to sort of see what you like about your current job and what you don't, and then figure out what you want to keep as you're moving forward. I think informational interviews are so important. Even during this time of coronavirus, I know sometimes people are afraid to reach out for informational interviews, but I would say go for it. You can put in a caveat of, I know this time is crazy for everybody, but, so if you don't have time, that's fine. But I would say don't hesitate to reach out to people. Explore online resources and webinars like you're doing now. There's a lot of great organizations out there. Save job listings that interest you. So whenever I get an email or something that has a job that I'm like, oh, maybe I'd like to do that in the future, I actually save it to a special folder that's called interesting jobs. And so then if I'm looking for my next big move, I can just go to that, and not that that job's still available, but I kind of remember what had interested me in the past. Attending the AAA's annual meeting, super important. This year it's going to be virtual, but it's a really great networking opportunity. Read broadly. There's some foundational science policy texts that could be helpful to sort of contextualize what you're interested in and help you understand sort of how science policy has evolved to where it is today. The Twitter community is so important. I know I've seen a lot of you all on Twitter, so that's great. And it's keep engaging in that way. And then side projects and extracurriculars are so important, and those really help you throughout the self-reflection process, because it tells you what you enjoy spending your time on. Because, all of these extracurriculars are on top of your PhD work, and you wouldn't do it if they didn't make you happy. So those are all things to keep in mind. And then also when you're thinking about your why, there's a lot of questions you can ask yourself. So great one is, who do you admire? I'm a huge podcast person, and so I find a lot of cool people through podcasts. And so you can kind of keep a list in your head of I would love to be that person. Andy Slavitt is one of my like heroes. And so thinking through that, what do you read about in your free time? What type of work do you like to do? What area do you currently work in, and who do you work with, and do you want to like pivot or stay in that particular field? And then for your job, how important mentorship is to you. Do you want to be in an environment that's political or partisan? And your future plans for a fellowship in particular, if you want to have a stable job or if you just want to use it as a quick stop onto something new. And the reason I mention that is because some fellowships really lend themselves to then being hired on afterwards, and others are more very clearly just a quick experience. And then this is the last thing I'm going to say before we break up into defining our own whys, is there 3 important things to think about when you're defining your why. And first is to be specific. Second is to prioritize. And third is to be flexible. So when I say be specific, I think a lot of people, when they're thinking about science policy fellowships, they want to do it because they want to make a transition to a science policy career. And they're like, I don't really care what I'm working on. I just want to get out of the lab. I'm like, that's great. But we need to think a little bit more deeply, not just because you want to write something better in your essay, but also because it's going to be helpful when you're finding your placement or even deciding whether the fellowship is the right fit for you. And so a way to be more specific includes some of these examples that are written here. Another thing in terms of prioritization to think about is, are you more interested in, so for example, for my particular fellowship, I'm at the VA. And I chose to be at the VA because I was a biomedical researcher and I want to work in healthcare policy. And the VA is a healthcare system. And so that was the most important thing to me, was working in a healthcare system. So when I saw that the VA was one of the placement options, that was my top priority. Someone else's top priority might be working in an environment where they have really close mentorship. And so they would prioritize that over what particular field or topic area they're in. Or someone else might be like, I really want to work on international policy. So like, I know for sure I want to be at the State Department or USAID. And so that's what I mean by prioritization. And then for be flexible, I think you can have these specific statements like the ones I have listed here. And you can see that while they're specific in what your why is, they don't say, I want to be on the front line of healthcare reform by working on the Hill for Elizabeth Warren. And it's like, okay, that's like not very actionable, and also shows that you're not very flexible in where you want to be. So you can say, I want to set strategy for agency-wide initiatives. You could do that at literally any agency, and it would really be a great fit for that goal. So now that I've spoken for a little while, I think it would be good if we break up into our breakout groups, and just for 10 minutes, and you can do a little self-reflection and talk through with your group. Maybe you already have a why, maybe you've realized you want to refine it a little further, and then we'll come back and I'd love to hear some examples. You can share them over video or just in the chat box. Okay, cool. So yeah, I'd love to hear any reflections, whether they're your own or you heard something great in your breakout group about how to define your why. So does anyone want to raise their hand to share or put it in the chat? I know a few of you, so I can just call the people I know out.
Hey, well, I'll go ahead and speak.
Great.
First of all, I wanted to thank you for talking about getting rejected from fellowships, because I just got rejected as a top 3 finalist from one this year, and that really sucked, but it makes me feel better that there's hope on the other side. And we had a really great breakout room, and what I realized is that my focus is on diversity and inclusion in STEM and also education. So I kind of have 2 main pillars that I want to focus on, and I feel like I can incorporate those, possibly weave them together kind of as my why. I don't know exactly how I want to apply that yet. That's a little intimidating, but I'll get there.
That's awesome. And that's a great point, is that you can really have two different things that fit well together. Like my two were healthcare reform and translating scientific topics so they're easy to understand. And I sort of wove those together throughout my essay, throughout my interviews. And the thing we'll get into next is the fact that you have to build a story and a brand for yourself and make sure that that is woven throughout all parts of the interview process. And so we'll talk more about that. Do I have anyone else that wants to share? Maybe one more. Brave souls.
I can go if somebody.
Oh, great.
So we had a really good conversation. Some of them were still deciding if they thought that, why is it that they're interested in it? Other ones, somebody, sorry, I wrote their names down. So Anna is already a fellow in another fellowship. So they were talking about their experiences. And for me, it was helpful to listen to their thoughts, because in my case, my PhD, it's in science education. So I have a master's in immunology, but I decided before that I wanted to go into the field of education. So I just feel like policy will allow me to maybe in the future, long term, influence more how education is done in the country using research, right? So maybe having the experience of being in a lab and also being a researching education, sort of like putting those together to like influence policy in education, but also outreach and inclusion. So
that's great. That's awesome.
And this was helpful.
Thanks for sharing. Oh, sorry, just got a work call, declined. Okay. So let's continue on. Share my screen again, and here we go. Okay. So now we'll kind of move more into the applying stage. So after you've defined your why and created a story for yourself, the next part is applying. One major part of that, probably one of the most important parts, is the essay, because this is the part where you're really telling the story about yourself and who you are. And my biggest piece of advice to people when I talk to them about applying is really explaining why this fellowship is key to your pivot, almost as if this fellowship is, you're at this precipice where you have to decide which direction your career is going to go in. Are you going to stay in academia? Or are you going to do something completely different? And the thing about doing something completely different is that it's scary, and you need experience and you need confidence to do it. And that's what the fellowship does for you. And so when you're writing your essay, you have to think about how all the experiences that you've had your entire life, it doesn't have to go all the way back to like your birth, but think when this journey started for you, have really led you here to make this fellowship the best fit for you, and you a great fit for this fellowship. So, and in addition to that, you need to communicate how, why your future goals require this fellowship to make it happen. So why is it that, if you want to work on education policy as a researcher and provide evidence and data to make evidence-based policy for education, the only way you're going to get there is by getting some sort of policy experience. And so that's what makes this particular fellowship vital for that future goal. And so those are sort of some key things. Next is applying for references. So again, another part of your story. Obviously, you'll have one person who knows your scientific expertise. Usually this is your PI. And then I always say the other one or two references that are required should be someone that knows you outside of the lab context. So you should have a clear insight on your leadership, project management, and policy expertise and interests. Hopefully they have an understanding of some of those things just through interacting with you. But it's also really great to give your referees your personal statement that is your personal statement for this fellowship and your CV so that they understand your why and can incorporate that into their reference. And then for the AAAS fellowship in particular, it's kind of a two-stage process. So the first stage of the process is you are applying so that you have this selection committee that selects you to be a finalist. And then once you're a finalist, you have to do additional interviews with a bunch of agencies around the federal government to find your placement. And the placement interviews are more of like a two-way street conversation because you're also interviewing those federal agencies. And this is really where you finding a fit for yourself is going to be so important. It's less about, at that point, you've already been vetted. They know you're good. It's so you don't have to really like put on a show and dance for these agencies. You're trying to find out whether or not this agency or this office is going to get you where you need to be. And the reason I say that is I think a lot of people come to the AAAS fellowship in particular, coming from lab environments maybe that weren't great, or just think when I get this fellowship, everything's going to be magically amazing. And that's just not the case. Every job is difficult. So you have to really be intentional about where you're being placed. And then even when you're in your placement, making sure you set yourself up for success through the projects you're working on and the interactions and networking you're doing. So some of the factors you have to consider for finding a placement are things like the location of the office, mentorship. I mentioned this earlier, but putting out fires or setting your own pace. Those are sort of two different styles of policy and policy offices, and you have to decide which you like better. Travel is a huge thing. Partisanship. One that's listed here is how many hands in the office. The reason I say this is if you're in an office where there's a lot of young, ambitious people, that's really great because you have this amazing network you're building, but at the same time, that means there's more hands around to do exciting, fun projects. So that means it could be a little bit competitive to get onto those projects. And sorry, I'm having trouble with my mouse, so I can't get onto a chat. So if there's anything, a chat question that's come up, I can't see it right now.
Oh,
Ryan.
Sure. Yeah, I just have a quick question.
Yeah.
I don't know if we were okay to stop.
Yeah, it's fine.
I was just wondering if it matters what the title or position of your referees, if that matters at all. Like if you have one who's like from someone who's more junior in their career, will that like be a disadvantage to an application in some way? Or are you looking for people who are also have leadership positions like chairs and deans and things like that?
Yeah, so first what I'll say is I've never been involved in selection committees for any of these fellowships, so I can't say from their perspective what they're looking for. But in my mind, I would always try to go with someone that knows me as a person better versus title or stature. I think that would be a good question to reach out to the fellowships about as well. But I think that would be my answer.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Hey, Steph, one quick thing. Just
Yeah.
in terms of questions, we'll just hold those off until afterwards, just so you can at least get through the presentation first.
Okay, great. Yeah, and we are almost done. Yeah, and I want to make sure to get through the presentation before the hour is up. Okay. And so now I'm just going to transition into, we have like 2 more slides, general advice, which is listed here. And this is more general advice about making sure your fellowship is successful. So first of all, fellowships are about meeting new people and developing new skills. It's okay to be a little selfish during your fellowship. When you're first coming into a fellowship, you need to sort of establish yourself and make sure you're super helpful and volunteering for things, etc. But if you need to work with your mentor to make sure that you're not filling your plate with projects that are more about just getting, being an extra hand in the office, but they're actually projects where you can take initiative and independence. And that's what the part of this fellowship is. It's not a job. So you're not there to you're not there to just be an extra hand. You're there to help in an intentional way and be on projects and be independent. And that's something you kind of need to think about when you're going through the interview process with different offices, is making sure that they understand what the difference between a job is and what a fellowship is. I have compartmentalized in big capital letters because there's so much going on in a fellowship. I have like so many projects going on at one time that I can't possibly be working on every single project in one day. And so a lot of times I just literally have to like put one project in another part of my mind and not think about it until like I have a meeting that particular day for it. And that's like a different way of working for me. I think usually I like to, as a grad student, be constantly thinking about the problems and the things I'm working on, but it's just not possible in policy because you have so many different things that might not be intertwined like a PhD project is. Another thing I do is save compliments and good news emails into a rainy day folder. So whenever anyone tells me I did something great, I like put that into a folder in my Outlook that's literally called rainy day. And so I can like look at that when I'm having a bad day. Advice comes by word of mouth. So talk to a lot of people. This is so true, especially for the Mirzayan and the AAAS fellowships. You can get like pointed, specific advice about how to apply, how to navigate the interview process by talking to people. It's things that aren't listed on the website. And then lastly, I say be kind to everyone, and humility is key. DC, if you haven't been here, is a small place, and especially the science policy community. So you never know who is going to be at your next job. Like it happens all the time where a new person will come to my office and they already knew somebody because they worked at a different office with them like 10 or 15 years ago or something. So it's just really important. And I think it's worth saying to be kind to everyone. And then the last slide is something that I think is really important for these particular times. It's about networking during a pandemic. And I have a few different pieces of advice. First and foremost, the best way I find to network is when you're working with people toward a common goal. So it's not just about reaching out and having an informational interview, like that's okay too. But when you're actually working with somebody, that's how you get to know them. So volunteer or take on a new leadership role, join a team essentially is what I'm telling you to do. There's a organization called the Day One Project, which is about writing different policy proposals for the next presidential administration. They have an accelerator with a deadline of 6/22, which is coming up. But I definitely recommend checking that out. I was part of their inaugural cohort, and that was an awesome experience. Virtual internships and fellowships, freelance groups, or freelance work and writing groups. And then, yeah, so that's like my very like key piece of advice, I think. I don't know if that people think about that a lot, but that's like the best way to get to know anybody is by working with them on something. And then virtual networking events and webinars. There's a really great one that happens once a month. ESEP and NSPN, they have these events, and last one they did like a cocktail demonstration hour, and it was just a really fun time. And then really recommend doing one-on-one networking too. For me, one-on-one is a lot more valuable and refreshing. And so check in with old contacts, do phone calls, grab a virtual coffee with someone during the day. And lastly, I don't know if this is the right phrase, but I call it horizontal networking. The best people to network and get to know are the people that are like within your cohort level. So whether that's someone in graduate school that's in a science policy group at a different campus, or for me, fellows that I haven't met before. And the reason I say that is because they're often much more accessible to you and you feel like less weird about reaching out to them. And also like they're going to be the ones that you're like working at the White House with someday, right? If your goal is to be like entering into the science policy world together, it's so important to get to know people that are at your same like cohort level, and not just focus on networking up. So that would be, I think, the last piece of advice. And yeah, so just to close, this sort of thinking about your why involves a whole lot of things, networking, reflection, but it's like a constant process. It's not like you just define your why and then like that you're good. I sort of update my goals and my goals for the year. I kind of do it every 6 months. I sort of revisit my goals and what I'm aiming toward. So I really suggest doing that as well. I think that is everything. Ryan, is it possible for you to stop my screen share? Because I can't do it. My like cursor isn't working. Oh wait, hold on. No, I got it. Got it.
Okay.
Okay. All right. So yeah, so Ryan, I think you said you had a way you wanted to facilitate a discussion, or do you want me to just call people out, or?
Yeah, Steph. So I'll moderate the question session. So if you have a question, you can type it out. If you don't want to unmute, and I'll just read the question from the chat box. But if you have a question for Steph, you can also just ask. So go ahead.
I've got a question. First off, thanks so much, Steph. Really appreciate the talk. So for going into the STPF and I guess other similar fellowship programs, if you have knowledge of this, how free do you think people are really able to be with what their subject of experience is versus their subject of policy interest? So for example, like I'm an entomologist, but I'm interested in health policy and energy policy outside of kind of my traditional training. So in the agency selection process, when you're trying to find a good fit, is there a decent amount of flexibility there?
Yeah, that's a great question. There's a ton of flexibility. I would say the one thing that's challenging about the AAAS process is that it's so long. So you're writing your essay in November and then you're not interviewing until April. And the problem with that is that when you're doing your placement interviews, the offices are searching your application to determine whether or not they want to interview you or not. And so if in that like 6 months you've decided, I really want to do international travel and policy, but you didn't put that in your essay, you're likely not going to get invited for interviews to those agencies. But the good thing is that there's an opportunity for you to reach out to agencies and request interviews before the whole process starts. And that sounds like, oh gosh, why would anyone want me if they didn't want me at the start? But like you can just present your case as to why you're interested in that office. And like, for example, I got 2 offers for placement at AAAS. One of them was VA and one of them was an office that I requested. So like it's very possible to get a placement in an office that didn't want you at first. And then the last thing I'll say is that I would say definitely be free about that in your essay, because if you're really interested in those topics, like those are keywords that they might be searching to find out whether they do want to interview. But it's not the end of the world if they don't find you at first either.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
So we just got a question from the chat box from Ashurya. She asks, I was hoping Steph could answer why she decided to do both the Marzan Fellowship and the AAAS Fellowship. She says most people I've spoken to decided to do one or the other and then proceed directly into work. So do you have any?
It was honestly timing. So when you apply for the AAAS Executive Branch Fellowship, you have to have your PhD in hand. So I applied. So I graduated in June 2018, which meant I could only apply in November 2018, and I couldn't start till September 2019. So I had about a year and a half of time to fill up before, and I was taking a risk that I was going to get the AAAS fellowship, but I had about a year of time to fill up. And so, yeah, I did 6 months in my PhD lab postdocing, And I was like, I got to get out of here. I'm moving to DC in January, no matter what. And then thank God I got the Mir Zion, because otherwise I would have just been like, I don't know what I would have done. So yeah. And the thing is with the Mir Zion, it was a very different experience, right? So I worked on diversity and inclusion. So I like very intentionally wanted to work on something not related to biomedical research, because I wanted to just see how policy was. And that was a great experience for me, because it made me realize, and kind of this goes to Ben's point, is that even though my PhD was in something, I could still contribute meaningfully to other topic areas as a scientist, as someone who's good at project management. And so that was a really good confidence booster for me too.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
We have a question from Ryan. So he asks, I've heard different and often conflicting kinds of advice about applying for fellowships when it comes to focus versus flexibility, knowing what you want to do versus being adaptable and interested in multiple potential placements. So Steph, how did you strike the balance in your own application?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think the best way to think about it is, an analogy would be like, if you think about what your PhD is on and what field you work in. So my PhD was on lung cancer therapeutics combining drugs that targeted oncogenes and epigenetic readers. And that's what I like to work on. And that's the only thing I want to work on. And it's like, that's a very narrow focus, okay? But then if I go into it and say, I want to work on biomedical research that creatively thinks about how to target challenging diseases, like that's a much broader way of presenting what your interests are, that gives you a lot of options. So I think that's what, so yeah, so, but it's still kind of a specific statement, right? So I think that would be my best answer is, you can be specific, but in a way that doesn't close off your options. Does that make sense, Ryan? Okay.
Yes, thank you so much.
Mm-hmm.
Hey, Steph. So you were talking about failures, and I know this is about applying to fellowships and whatnot, but what if you apply to multiple fellowships and you keep getting rejected? What other opportunities are out there that you can use to get this policy experience besides the fellowships?
Yeah, that's a great question. And that actually was like a caveat I meant to bring at the beginning, is that a fellowship's not the only way that you can work in science policy. I have a lot of friends now who had never, did a fellowship but work in science policy. I think the thing to realize is that there's, first of all, you can just apply to government jobs. I have some friends that have done that. But there's also a thing to realize is there's a lot more policy out there than just the government. So in DC itself, there's so much policy that happens at the foundation level, like nonprofits, philanthropies. And you as a researcher have a lot of experience in, maybe writing grants or thinking about how funds are administered. There's also a lot of opportunities within professional societies to do work there. And also, like, I would really recommend, I don't think I pointed this out on the slide, but most academic universities have government relations offices. So I would say during graduate school, maybe explore working with them. So I wouldn't be discouraged if you don't get a fellowship. There are other ways. It just sometimes, though, just might screw up your timeline, right? Like I thought I was also like, I think like number 2 or 3 for the American Society of Human Genetics research. And if I had gotten that, I would have moved to DC 6 months sooner than I did, right? And so, but then I wouldn't have met all my awesome Mir Zion cohort members. Shout out Melody and Anna, who are on this call. So yeah, I hope that helps. I think it's just realizing that there's a lot more ways to do policy than being in the government. And I think the main, from my experience, like I wanted to do policy in DC. So I think the main thing to do is just like get yourself to DC and get a job here. And then it's really easy to sort of network your way into finding other opportunities. That's not to say there aren't policy jobs in other states, but that would be my advice for like the type of policy I want to do.
Great. That's really helpful. Thank you.
Was there another question? Oh, that was Ryan's. Okay. Anything else?
So I have a question, Steph. So this might be kind of like a weird one, but like what if there isn't a specific policy fellowship that you would be interested in? Like, is there any way to like create like a job description? Like for me personally, I would really love to still do research and work in a lab, but then also like inform policymakers, but I don't know of like any jobs where you do that. So do you have any suggestions for that kind of role, or do you know any fellowships that have that?
Yeah, that's a great question. I don't know any fellowships off the top of my head, but I would say if you're interested in that in general, in terms of being a researcher, but at the same time influencing policy, maybe at the local level, there's an organization called Engaging Scientists, or no, Engineer. I always think it's engaging, but it's engineers and scientists acting locally. And it's bad that I can't remember that because I'm now their development director, but so engineers and scientists acting locally, and they have a local engagement playlist or playbook that's about essentially what you're just saying is like, what if you don't want to leave your full-time job, but you still want to interact with policy? The other thing I'd say is like networking is huge. Like the summer before the AAAS fellowship, I had 3 different freelance jobs, and you could do something like that. Those freelance jobs, one of them was writing up a policy chapter for a report on cancer health disparities. Another one was running a Twitter account for a journal. And then the other one was writing up that science policy careers report. And the reason I got like all 3 of them is because these are people that were in the network I developed in graduate school or from the failed application. So it all comes, and like people think networking is a dirty word, but it's like it just all comes down to building these relationships with people, and then just asking those people like, hey, your organization is really interesting to me. Do you have an opportunity, or do you need someone to do some part-time work for you? And then it's your calculus to decide whether or not you need it to be paid or if you want to do it volunteer.
So just a follow-up question. I guess you already talked a little bit about how you found your freelance work. Did you just like email people and ask them, hey, do you have a job for me? Or how did you do that?
Yeah, I had coffee with the AACR folks, and they're asking what I was up to. And I was like, well, like, you know, because I didn't say this, it was like, because I didn't get your fellowship, my fellowship starts later. But I was like, I have a whole summer and I'm going to be in DC, just like, you know, hanging out. And they're like, oh, wow. And they're like, well, we really enjoyed your, you know, it just kind of like, it kind of just happened organically. And I was like, I'm really interested in like what we talked about. I didn't even expect it, to be honest. They kind of brought it up to me, and I was like, I just really loved what we talked about with cancer health disparities. Like, are you guys doing anything with that? And they're like, actually, we are writing this report, but like, gosh, the timeline's really hard, you know? And I was like, oh, well, if you need help, like, I'm around. And then the other one was a little more direct because this was a mentor I had from graduate school. And I was doing a trip up to Boston to visit friends, and I had lunch with her, and I was like, hey, so I need some money this summer. Do you guys have a report or any research you need to be done for your organization? And we just like worked out a deal that way. So
yeah,
being direct is good.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.